I'm going to be a little bit controversial here and say that I don't think homelessness is as bad as everyone says it is across England. Let me rephrase that. That statutory council services are struggling as much as the headline suggests, because obviously we see headlines all the time. Councils like Birmingham, Croydon, Leicester, Nottingham, basically going under almost pretty much because of the strain on their resources. And I think that potentially lots of other councils can hide behind those headlines because everyone assumes that's the picture across the country, when actually the amount of variation across the country is huge. I've done other videos about average waiting times, for example, and just showing how much that varies across the country. I'm actually drawing some stats here, again, from the government's Homelessness Live tables, and basically looking at the number of families who are housed in B&B type accommodation for more than 6 weeks. Now, that might seem like a really obscure figure to zone in on, but if you actually look at the Homelessness Code of Guidance, it basically says all accommodation offered under Housing Act duties or powers has to be suitable. And actually, if you read the wording of 16.30, it says that housing authorities must not use B&Bs to accommodate families with children or pregnant women, except where there is no alternative available, and then for a maximum of not exceeding 6 weeks. So in effect, councils can only use B&Bs for families if there is literally nowhere else already. And even then, they can't use it for more than 6 weeks. Now, both of these figures are actually reported on every quarter by most councils. I'll come back to that. There seems to be quite a few councils who don't report their figures back to central government, but that's another issue. But basically, in this situation, I think this actually acts as a proxy for seeing how stretched a council really is. And if you actually look at the worst offenders, you won't be surprised. Birmingham's at the top. So in the last quarter, Birmingham had 647 families with children or pregnant women over that 6 week limit. Now, every single one of those households can complain, and the LGSCO would recommend compensation in those cases. I've done a video specifically about how that's calculated and how easy it is to get it. But equally, I've also done a video recently, maybe a week or so ago, which was looking at Leicester Council, who basically refused to follow the LGSCO's recommendations to pay compensation for a family who were left in a B&B accommodation for over that 6 week period. So Leicester's the third worst council in the country for this figure. Ealing's up there, Waltham Forest. You probably wouldn't be surprised by who's up there, really. I mean, I'd say there's basically about 25 or 30 councils with more than 20 households over that 6 week limit, out of 300 odd councils across the country. As I say, there's probably about 50 or so that didn't report, so some of those may have higher figures, but I don't think they do. I think the worst offenders are actually providing these figures back to central government. And if we actually look at this map here, so I've kind of compiled a map looking at this data and kind of grouped it into areas where there are 0 families over the 6 week limit, then 1 to 5 and 6 to 10 and so on. We actually look at a map, we can see that the majority of England is either light blue, which means there's 0 families over the limit, or light green, where there's basically less than 5. And homelessness is so complex that I guess you are going to have those situations where families might be over the 6 week limit just because of the complexities of their situation. So it doesn't necessarily kind of mean that the council's systematically failing people. It just might mean that there's these kind of unusual cases come along which basically flummox everyone and end up people living over the 6 week limit there. And again, we can see that just that variation. And I guess that's probably one of the points I want to make from this video, is just that variation. But as I say, I think some of these blue councils will wave their hands and say, councils are really strapped for cash, when really they are not really, they're not really feeling the pinch in the way that Birmingham, Croydon, Nottingham, Ealing would be. And I think, if nothing else, this is a bit of an encouragement. If you're working in one of these light blue or green areas, it's probably going to mean that really, not only are you going to get a better service if you help someone approach that council, because they're not going to be stuck in unsuitable accommodation, or they're less likely to, but also you're probably going to have less resistance to actually getting that council to act lawfully. And probably as well, I'd say there's probably a correlation between councils with low numbers in over the 6 week limit and councils who house people in their area rather than housing them 300 miles away. So that's just all stuff to be aware of. But again, I'm just kind of zoning on this issue where I think some councils, I don't know what Brentwood's kind of public statements are about homelessness, but we saw Brentwood being basically named and shamed earlier this year with the LGSCO report, where they looked at figures of a 6 month period and they realised that in 90% of cases people were approaching Brentwood and being gate-kept and basically denied housing unlawfully. Now, if you actually look at the figures of how many families were in B&B over the 6 week limit in Brentwood, it's 0. And that again says to me that they are not struggling in the same way that some other councils are. And what that probably also means, I'm going to speculate here, is that Brentwood's failure to follow the law is probably not driven by its lack of resources. It's probably driven by senior officers somewhere along the line essentially deliberately putting policies in place which basically gatekeep people and make it too hard to actually apply for assistance there. So I'll find a way of kind of putting these figures on. As I say, I don't think it's not as useful as the average waiting time video I did recently, but for me it does kind of give you an idea of the worst councils. And whilst I'd say I'm to be optimistic in some of these blue areas, if you're working in Birmingham, Ealing, Leicester, Croydon, those kind of areas, you do have your work cut out. You're probably much more likely to need this list to actually get good outcomes. So if I just read the kind of top 10 or so. So Birmingham's worst was 647, then Ealing with 374, Leicester, Waltham Forest, Greenwich, Liverpool, Enfield with 100, Haringey, Sandwell, Croydon, Luton. I mean, Luton's another outlier when it comes to council housing kind of resources because it's so close to London and because house prices are relatively lower than surrounding areas. A lot of London councils house their homeless families and single people in accommodation in Luton, which then means Luton has nowhere to discharge their duties to lawfully. Luton's also a very kind of contained district. It's just kind of one town rather than having kind of rural areas they can spread out into. So yeah, Oldham, Nottingham, Kirklees, Hillingdon, Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole. So again, you're probably not going to be surprised by those figures really in terms of which ones are seeing it worse. But just kind of, I guess, you look at the other end of the scale where we have all these councils where actually they're not even having to resort to using B+Bs for families over the 6-week limit at all. That says to me that those areas, when they say they don't have resources to follow the law, I think they probably do.